ghosts, psychics, pendulums, curses, hexes. We welcome you here to Friday Night Dark in the realm of the night. Come join us and listen to this week's presentation, and we bid you welcome.
Good evening. This is Drew, and I welcome you back to Friday Night Dark. Hey, tonight I'm going to be talking about a subject. It's called Bibliomancy. Now, a while back, I did a whole series of different, what I'll call pseudosciences. This is actually one that was on the list, and I decided at the last minute I was going to go ahead and change direction. It didn't mean that I didn't want to talk about it. It just meant that, well, I thought maybe perhaps there was way too much for folks to digest. And I did say at one time I would return. This is not uncommon for me to actually change directions on a regular basis. But again, this is just because I know that it's subject matters that if I bring them up, I want to make sure that folks know that I'm telling them clearly because there's a good inspiration and there's a why. And tonight it does actually have that. There's not only a why am I telling this tale, but I'm also going to give you a story about how this all affected me a long time ago. Let me start with this story. One night I attended a gathering on a warm August night, and there were folks making or talking about types of like divination. And so, of course, people talked about pendulums, astrology, tarot, runes, all kinds of tools for telling the future. But one person had a book of poems. There was silence and raised eyebrows. I know it's crazy, right? But hear me out. He stated that it was a way which was not contained to interpretation and accounting for position or who was influencing what. It was just words. And to test the idea, folks were picked at random, and the poetry was read aloud. One said the poem and the questions were off. And let me explain that. I guess you had to kind of like ask a question about something, and then you had to read the poem that you randomly picked. And the first person who volunteered, they just basically said it was not only off, but it was very unclear until later, that is. Now, the last person was downright dramatic. And what I mean by that is the poem was copied from another book, and it was called Coddleson Pie. And the question was the result of a marriage counseling session. His whole demeanor changed, and as he began to start reading this particular poem. The lines in each quatrain presented a struggle, and then after a while, his composure went from surety to one of struggle, and then came the emotional breakdown. He didn't finish the poem. And it was a clear message that was given to him, apparently. He noted as he regathered himself that it was a poem that his mom read to him the night before she died from a very nasty case of cancer. Her last words to him was just, remember, all we have are the limitations that we have. And it basically brought home something. And so in a way, he knew that things were going to change drastically. His answer came in a way that was unexpected. Ironically, he was talking with some people that he confided what was going on, and they did bring their cards just to see how things would turn out. The answer apparently had already been given. So if anything, it was a moment in which not only disturbed the reading, but it drove to silence the idea that maybe there was more to this than meets the eye. And of course, the process is labeled bibliomancy. Now, just to give you an eye breakdown of what I just can't talk today. Bibliomancy comes from two words, and of course, it's biblio, which it has a Latin transposition, or what do they call it, translation to meaning book. Although some people say this is where the idea of Bible comes from, and they are correct. But the idea itself, when you talk about mancy, it's divination. It's the art of summoning or divination of some sort. Cartomancy is another example. So, in this instance, you're using a book to divine an answer and get inspiration from spiritual forces. But this is not only the one time you would see this, is that there are concepts like this for rhapsodomancy, meaning poem, and it in itself has its own divination that can be brought from a passage of a poem itself. So it should come as no surprise that this would come back into my life again, and that's why I'm bringing this up tonight. Now, at its core, bibliomancy is the belief that a sacred or meaningful text can act as an oracle, and the practitioner asks a question, opens a book at random, and interprets the selected line as the message or omen. And this can be done with really pretty much anything from personal books, poetry, novels, sacred texts. It could be the Bible, it could be the Quran, it could be the Torah, it could be the I Ching. You take your pick. There's also classic literature, which I know the rhapsodomancy comes from because people would use Homer or Virgil. But I wonder sometimes, why not Winnie the Pooh or Catcher in the Rye? Now, bibliomancy has a deep historical root in several places. In ancient Greece, what is it called? Sortis Homericae, randomly selecting lines from Homer, which is an epic poem of, the journey from, I guess, in the Trojan Wars or whatnot. It's interesting because I know Homer actually means slave, but that's another story for another time. But then there's also Roman origins for this, which they talk about, Virgil's Aeneid for prophecy. Even emperors apparently use this idea in being able to divine answers when they really needed something. In China, you have the I Ching, which uses the text that's via a coin or a yarrow stalk for, that gives them some kind of idea or guidance that way. And of course, this was also adopted in Christianity. Medieval Christians practiced stories. What do they call it? Sortes Sanctorum, which is basically you're opening the Bible at random. And so, really honestly, I think there seems to be quite a few cultures that I've mentioned already that carry these kind of examples of use. And these examples lets you know that it's a tool that's been around for many years and in places folks would not think of. It also means you don't need fancy tools or cards or what have you. Now, I'm not going to do this to cheapen anything else that's there, but rather just the opposite, that I think that if someone was looking for guidance, sometimes it might be a book that you're familiar with and just opening to a random page. Really, just a book. And one that you can open at will. And if it does anything, it will certainly give you an answer. It may not necessarily be the answer, but you can certainly do that. Now, this brings me to how does it work? I know that there's a lot of folks out there that will talk about bibliomancy, and they'll say, well, you got to do this, so you got to do that. But in all honesty, most traditions follow a very similar pattern. And I know it's something that I didn't really figure would be a big deal until I started looking into this. And really honestly, I did know about this, the idea of bibliomancy, but at the same time, it wasn't one that I, really paid attention to until some time back. And this is what I mean. Um, when I had that encounter or whatnot, it stuck in my mind, and much later it resulted in the sale of 2 books. And I'll get to that in a minute. But this is how it basically goes, is that first you want to choose a meaningful book. Often it could be anything from sacred type stuff to, symbolically important stuff. It doesn't have to be anything really like, philosophical or anything, or even religious. I have a book called The Advanced Guidebook for the Soul, as I mentioned earlier, and it works great. And I know folks have seen me demonstrate this a while back. Now, the second portion of this is that you want to focus on a question or intention. Now, remember that meat I was telling you about? Some folks didn't take it too seriously, but if you do, like any other divination tool, you might need a moment to focus. Once you are grounded in that frame of thought, and you're I can't even talk today, and you're open to receiving a message, you're ready. That's when it's going to happen. Now, when you open the book randomly, that's the next step. Sometimes you can do so by balancing it on its spine and letting the book open on its own. And this can be hard because if it's a new book, it could basically open to a certain page, sometimes technically the middle. But in some instances, if it's a well-read book, it might open to another page. We'll get to that in just a second. But if you select a line with your eyes closed, or if you just point, as soon as it starts to open, that's what you're going to pick. There isn't a right or wrong way. I'll let you decide what you want to do. But this part, no matter how contrived it feels, you have to trust in its revelation. And that's the part that I think sometimes leaves things open for some other opportunities, and we'll talk about that in a second as well. Now, when you get to this next step, this is where you interpret the passage basically as guidance. And basically it could be an answer, some kind of an omen. Remember when I told you about the whole Coddleson Pie poem? That was his answer. It was not only an omen in a way, but it was also kind of giving him a gentle push, saying, this is what's going to happen. Remember, you're only limited to this. And that's the message it was giving him that night. And so basically, yes, he was going to lose his marriage, but, we can only do what we can do, right? Now, remember that book I mentioned and I posted about? It's one that I found the same year, and I bought 2 of them, one for myself and one for someone else. And honestly speaking, even though I had that experience and I saw something that took place, I scoffed at it and I said, I don't know. But I sat there and I looked at the book and I said to myself, okay, all right, I'll hold a question in my mind and I'm going to turn it to a random page and I'll have my answer, right? So by trying right then and there, it convinced me. And the reason is because I decided to be a smart aleck. And I said, I'm going to turn the book all the way over. And there it was. There was an answer on there. And it was, trust in your path or something like that. But the last line was the selling point for me because it read, nothing is by chance. Now, I looked at that for a second and I said, you know what? Okay, you got me. I'll buy it. So, of course, I bought one for myself as well as a gift for someone else I was going to give it to. But it was never, it was never really something that I thought that I would find myself buying. And yet I walked out with 2. Really, I mean, it's just in itself is kind of like ironic. But it was a newer book and it was stiff. So, it was kind of hard to choose a page at first. But I found myself experimenting with it. And, over time it became a well-read book as I kind of went through this and tried to see how it worked or what makes it work or what have you. And, this makes for a change right here. Because this process on a newer book may only open to a certain page, But on the other hand, if it was an older book, it may open better, suggesting familiarity, and still might have stuff on the page from food and coffee or other things that make things stick. No, not that. Look, it's going to be a book you may know or you may not know. Someone said to me once that, if you pick a book that's well read and personal, that it may mean more. But this is because there's going to be more interaction by you on that book. And therefore, there'll be a more responsive type of reaction, or perhaps even a result from that it would be. Now, the other thing about it, though, is that if you know it's going to come to a certain page and it's sticky, or it's got dirt, or it's got things on it, then there's something significant about that page and you might open to it. Does that necessarily mean that this book that you're using for this type of divination is fake? Well, I don't think so. Remember, I did several posts of this, and I put them out there for a reason. And I'll probably talk about that here in just a moment. But this interaction, by you on a book, it may actually create a more responsive result from all of that. And so if you have to say to yourself, well, why? Well, because when you select it, it's argued a familiar book might be a subconscious pick. But what if it's a Bible? Or what if it's a tech manual? Yes, I mean it. I mean, some folks think these are Bibles. It sounds weird, but remember again, the idea of bibliomancy is that you're using a book. There's nothing specific. You can use sacred texts, but why not a tech manual? I mean, that is a Bible for some people. I keep having visions of, what's his name from Star Trek? Scotty, the engineer from the original Enterprise. And he would go on vacations, and you want to know what he would do. Well, at least the character. I don't know if James Doohan did it himself, but Scotty, the character, would literally go and take updated tech manuals on his vacation and read them. And, there's a special kind of person that does that. I am not that special kind of person. And I was a technician. I know there were a lot of people that would probably tell you that, I was good, but there are other people that probably would argue that. But in any case, I can certainly say that I did have a couple of tech manuals that I still do have around, as a matter of fact. But either way, some pages may be viewed more often in reference. And as an example, I did actually have one book that showed me how to do certain things with certain networking devices. And I could actually at one point cite by memory because I read them so often. But this brings it to a point. So what this does, though, if you're familiar to a certain page, this makes for wiggle room on how one can debunk this whole idea. And you're probably saying, well, how? Well, bibliomancy taps into several well-documented cognitive processes that make random I can't even talk today. That make random passages feel personally relevant. So I'm going to give you an example. You open a book and there's something that it says, you point to it and it says, this is not the time. That's all it says. That's the sentence. Now, it could be something, this is not the time when you want to do this, you want to wait until blah. Or if I were to put it another place, it was a poem, it was, this is not the time to mess around with this or something, I don't know. But either way, just the fact that you picked this sentence could be the answer, regardless of the book. But what if it's a page it opens to automatically and you just happen to point your finger there, not thinking about it? Well, your subconscious might have done it. And that's the point. You're familiar with this book. However, when you open a book at random, your mind supposedly automatically links the words to whatever it is already that's on your mind. That means, regardless of the text, regardless of the context of the book, and regardless of the subject matter, it's already going to be on your mind what's there. So you're already open to whatever answer happens to be there. Now is not the time. That could be many things. And I know in some cases, some cards have key phrases that do that. There's times when I go live on TikTok and I actually will read off of the quotes that are on the tarot cards that I'll pull for people from time to time. Why? Because I feel compelled to do so. Does it mean that it's really anything more or less? No, it just means that at that moment I feel it's called for and I feel compelled to do it. And most of the times people will tell you that the only thing I ever ask for is 2 taps on the screen, which means that you're going to give a like. That's all I want. There's no charge. Now I know that probably ticks off a lot of people, but when I was doing that whole thing, I noticed there was a whole bunch of people that jumped on that boat right afterward. I don't think that they were like, feeling like threatened by me, but I also think that perhaps maybe people thought of this as a way to be able to do more, inspire people. And these are people that professionally do these kind of things, so more power to them, really. I just like to explore these ideas, and that was the why for this as well, because as I was going, I was, thinking, I opened it to something as I was, distracted by some other events that were taking place, and there was a phrase there, and it literally fit into some stuff that was going on. And I said, you know what? You're right. So I moved forward with something that I was debating whether or not to do. Now, I know this is a normal associative process, and the passage resonates because your brain is primed by your current emotions, concerns, or your goals. So it kind of skirts on things folks will call out to really invalidate this whole process, much like anything else. There's too much vagary involved here that any words you use in a specific fashion or order might actually tap into someone who is probably seeking some type of an answer anyhow. Why? Well, because you naturally focus on interpretations that validate what you already believe in or hope to be true. And I know that's one thing that people talk about all the time. There was a movie called Leap of Faith that actually had starred Steve Martin, and he played a reverend, and he was a backwater revival for a Christian camp that would go around from town to town. And they basically would do all these, healings or whatnot. What people didn't realize is that they were staged. Everything was staged from beginning to end. They fixed everything, and they went from town to town to town, and they would tons of money off of this. But that was their gig. That's how they made their living. And people would come and go. But one of the things that he told everybody is that, remember, if something goes to a certain way, it's because of their lack of faith, or someone in the room doesn't believe enough to help them get whatever miracle they're looking for. Keep that in mind, because right now with this, like I mentioned, you're naturally focused on interpretations that validate what you already believe or hope to be true. Put that in context with that, and of course you can kind of see how a naysayer immediately is going to say, oh, well, yeah, they're playing on you, this is all just a con job. No, it's not. I mean, happenstance can happen for different reasons, but this does make the message feel accurate to the person who sees it, even though the accuracy comes from your interpretation, not necessarily from the text itself. So this can be a confirmation bias idea, and stand for, really, people that are trying to debunk this will stand by this idea. And it's a powerful tool in this, but I would probably still not say it's nothing. To me would be by chance, just like the back of that book said. Sometimes these things come when we least expect it and we're not looking for it. And I think that's the one thing the debunkers probably are going to fail to look at, is not necessarily the text or the context from which the actual message came, but rather because they are looking at the fact that it's something that they're familiar with and they're trying to make that connection. So, yes, I mean, it sounds weird. I mean, if you think I'm debunking this deliberately, I'm not. I just want to show that this one can be especially sketchy. If you recall, I talked a while back about someone who was a psychometrist. That's basically you touch something and you get these psychic images and visions about something that pertains to the object that you're handling. And this kind of goes along the same guidelines because, like the book, the object gives off some message that can be interpreted. And if the person holding it happens to give intimate details of something that only the individual in front of them knows, it comes to, the idea of whether or not they had access or privy to the information or they were there at that time. The psychometrist I knew got in trouble with a couple of police detectives, and so they had to really explain themselves out. And by miracle, they actually had someone who knew them that came in and said, "No, you got the wrong person. Trust me, she's into weird stuff. You just got to let her go." Okay, they straightened it out, and they took down her name, and she couldn't leave for a very long time. But when they solved the case, then they saw everything come together and realized that she wasn't even involved. She just happened to know. And I think she spooked those detectives afterward. But anyway, I digress. One thing I would point out here is that all humans are wired to find patterns, especially when you're anxious or uncertain. There was a saying that was given to me once that you can read a passage from a book and two people will hear it and they're going to get two different ideas from it. And that's precisely one of the things that I think debunkers will probably play on. And the reason for it is that it's not because that they want to tear down somebody. It's because they feel that someone may understand it one way and misinterpret it. It doesn't matter whether it was the person who liked what they had to hear or the one who didn't. Either way, they can say that it was taken out of context or it was used out of context and it ticked them off or it made them happy. You can decide. But there isn't a person I've run into lately that would say, "Oh no, that doesn't happen," because they usually know why I'm making mention of that. Now, divination rituals, including bibliomancy, reduce anxiety by offering some kind of structure, narrative, and a sense of control. And these random things can be assembled to add meaning where it may normally not have one. And I think that's the one thing that people forget. Hope is a very powerful product. Now, whether it be Steve Martin's movie or it happens to be bibliomancy, you take your pick. Hope comes in many forms, and sometimes that hope comes with a message. It can inspire, it can discourage, it can do many things in between. And I think it's important that people realize, because it's such a powerful tool, you do have to be careful with it. Just like any other tool out there that has any kind of form of divination behind it. Now, this is the same psychological machinery behind fortune telling in general, and it's a form of pareidoia because you're seeing these patterns take place. And I once made a reference in explaining this idea of pareidoia by watching the shapes of the clouds, and so you kind of look at them and you see them, and then you kind of like make something out of them. Now, did you see them because that's what they were, or did you make them that way? And of course, then you suggest what you're seeing to someone else, and they say, "Hey, I see that too." Did they? Or were they just, able to see that because you transferred and you projected that idea onto them? This is where some of the arguments do come into play. And I'm making this point because it can be useful, but it can also suck you in and cheapen itself to something misleading. And I know that's one of the reasons why some naysayers will probably tell me, "Oh, well, yeah, that's just a bunch of hooey." And well, maybe for the people that misuse it, but for those that actually need an answer, remember Roman emperors used this, so you got to think there might be some truth to what happens in this. Is there truly a divine or paranormal force at work when you're using these things? It's possible. It doesn't necessarily make bibliomancy fake by any means on my book, pun intended, but it does make it psychologically functional. Now, remember the one guy I mentioned who had read aloud a random poem and he didn't understand the message? Later, the poem he remembered was recalled, and the words rang out loud in his head while he was talking to a friend who was having a very hard time. And it kind of like made this person unsettled, but then they felt better after having that conversation with him. Now, later he found out from that friend, much, much later, by the way, that he was contemplating taking his own life. The poem and its words that he actually had remembered while they were having that conversation encapsulated a solution for his friend. And so, if done for the right reasons, it can be a useful tool for self-reflection and for even helping someone who might need those words. Remember I told you that I actually did some kind of a random posting. I didn't even put words on or anything because I got the idea from other posts that were there. There's no words on this, and this message was meant for you. So I figured, I'm going to experiment. And that's how I experimented. I used that advanced guide for the soul, and I made random readings and I posted them. Now, I don't know if it helped anyone or if it didn't help or if it was just looked at it like a joke. I know there was a bunch of folks out there that actually, made comments. One person angrily asked me, so you have to do this in order to do that. And I said, well, if that's what the message is that you got, yeah. I really, you have to look at it, again, from what the message means to you. And that's why I talked about this tonight. Because as I had this compulsion to read those random readings, I had been doing some reflecting too, not just on this, but on other things. And it still bears meaning to me because I see people talk about this and other subjects quite a bit. So if it resonates, I guess it works, or does it? That's where I would probably leave that at your doorstep to decide. But if it doesn't work, and it may not be for you, that's also why I posted this earlier, that maybe perhaps it could be for someone else that you run into along the way. I still want to think that these messages that I posted might help someone. And I really hope that they do. But much like candles that I light, I'll bring this up again later, but for now, I think my message is pretty much clear. If you feel curious about, the message itself, if it resonates, use it. If it doesn't, remember it. And maybe perhaps the message might be passed on to someone that you could help later. That's what I wanted to convey with this. So really honestly, I would probably say, if you feel like maybe this is something you want to look at, well, I definitely encourage you to explore this subject, bibliomancy. And if you do explore this subject, maybe just maybe, you might start talking about it. And if you do start talking about it, hopefully, somewhere out there, you might start talking about it with me. Where else? Friday Night Dark at nitrax.com. Hey, this is Drew, and I bid you good night.